Section 1 of the World's Best Orations, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Total Echo. The World's Best Orations, Volume 3. The Dignity of Human Nature, by Horace Bushnell. Horace Bushnell illustrates a style of eloquence less suited than that of Henry Ward Beecher to subjects involving the emotions, but for many purposes equally effective. His discourse on the dignity of human nature shown from its ruins is governed by the same idea which inspired Taine in his remarkable analysis of Shakespeare's purposes and methods. Whether or not the world is a hospital for the sick of soul and mind, as Bushnell thought, and as Taine concludes that Shakespeare believed, there can be no question of the great power and extraordinary beauty of Bushnell's argument. It is perhaps his best example of sustained thought and eloquent expression, but his discourses abound in beauty and are generally characterized by power. When he surpasses himself, as he often does, he is equaled only by a very few among the most famous orators of the world. He was born at Litchfield, Connecticut, April 14, 1802. His pastorate at Hartford, which began in 1833, brought him continually increasing reputation. At a time when most pulpit reputations were made by sermons on politics, he devoted his mind to the elucidation of permanent truths, and, however far short of his best he may seem to fall at times, not a few of his characteristic passages are likely to live as long as the language. He died February 17, 1876. The great characters of the world furnish striking proof of the transcendent quality of human nature by the dignity they are able to connect even with their littleness and meanness. On a small island of the southern Atlantic is shut up a remarkable prisoner, wearing himself out there in a feeble mixture of peevishness and jealousy, solaced by no great thoughts and no heroic spirit. A kind of dotard before his time, killing and consuming himself by the intense littleness into which he has shrunk. And this is the great conqueror of the modern world, the man whose name is the greatest of modern names, or, some will say, of all the names the human world has pronounced. A man, nevertheless, who carried his greatest victories and told his meanest lies in close proximity, a character as destitute of private magnanimity as he was remarkable for the stupendous powers of his understanding and the more stupendous and imperial leadership of his will. How great a being must it be that makes a point of so great dignity before the world, despite of so much that is really little and contemptible. But he is not alone. The immortal Kepler, piloting science into the skies, and comprehending the vastness of heaven for the first time in the fixed embrace of definite thought, only proves the magnificence of man as a ruin, when you discover the strange ferment of irritability and superstition wild, in which his great thoughts are brewed and his mighty life dissolved. So, also, Bacon proves the amazing wealth and grandeur of the human soul only the more sublimely that, living in an element of cunning, servility, ingratitude, and dying under the shame of a convict, he is yet able to dignify disgrace by the stupendous majesty of his genius, and commands the reverence even of the world as to one of its sublimest benefactors. And the poet's stinging line, the wisest, brightest, meanest of mankind, pictures, only with a small excess of satire, the magnificence of ruin comprehended in the man. Probably no one of mankind has raised himself to a higher pitch of renown by the superlative attributes of genius displayed in his writings than the great English dramatist, flowering out, nevertheless, into such eminence of glory on a compost of fustian buffoonery and other vile stuff, which he so magnificently covers with splendor and irradiates with beauty, that disgust itself is lost in the vehemence of praise. And so we shall find almost universally that the greatness of the world's great men is proved by the inborn qualities that tower above the ruins of weakness and shame in which they appear, and out of which, as solitary pillars and dismantled temples, they rise. But we must look more directly into the contents of human nature and the internal ruin by which they are displayed. And here you may notice, first of all, the sublime vehemence of the passions. What a creature must that be who, out of mere hatred or revenge, will deliberately take the life of a fellow man, and then dispatch his own to avoid the ignominy of a public execution? Suppose there might be found some tiger that, for the mere bitterness of his grudge against some other whelp of his mother, springs upon him in his sleep and rends him in pieces, and then deliberately tears open his own throat to escape the vengeance of the family. No tiger of the desert is ever instigated by any so intense and terrible passion that, for the sweetness of revenge, it is willing afterward to rush on death itself. This kind of frenzy plainly belongs to none but a creature immortal, an archangel ruined, in whose breast of fire of hell may burn high enough and deep enough to scorch down even reason and the innate love of life. Or take the passion of covetousness, generally regarded as one essentially mean and degraded. After all, how great a creature must that be who is goaded by a zeal of acquisition so restless, so self-sacrificing, so insatiable? The poor, gaunt miser, starving for want, that he may keep the count of his gold, whom do we more naturally pity and despise? And yet he were even the greatest of heroes, if he could deny himself with so great patience in a good and holy cause. How grand a gift that immortality, how deep those gulfs of want in the soul, that instigate a madness so desolating to character, a self-immolation so relentless, a niggard suffering so sublime. The same is even true of the licentious and gluttonous lusts and their loathsome results. No race of animals can show the parallel of such vices, because they are none of them instigated by a nature so insatiable, so essentially great in the magnificence of wants, that find no good to satisfy their cravings. The ruin, we say, is beastly, but the beasts are clear of the comparison. It requires a mold vaster than theirs to burst the limits of nature in excesses so disgusting. Consider again the wild mixtures of thought displayed both in the waking life and the dreams of mankind. How grand, how mean, how sudden the leap from one to the other, how inscrutable the succession, how defiant of orderly control. It is as if the soul were a thinking ruin, which it verily is. The angel and the demon life appear to be contending in it. The imagination revels in beauty exceeding all the beauty of things, wails in images dire and monstrous, wallows in murderous and base suggestions that shame our inward dignity, so that a great part of the study and the principal art of life is to keep our decency by a wise selection from what we think and a careful suppression of the remainder. A diseased and crazy mixture, such as represents a ruin, is the form of our inward experience, and yet a ruin how magnificent, one which a buried Nineveh or a desolated Thebes can parallel only in the faintest degree, comprehending all that is purest, brightest, most divine, even that which is above the firmament itself, all that is worst, most sordid, meanest, most deformed. Notice also the significance of remorse. How great a creature must that be that, looking down upon itself from some high summit in itself, some throne of truth and judgment which no devastation of order can reach, withers in relentless condemnation of itself, gnaws and chastises itself in the sense of what it is, call it a ruin, as it plainly is, there rises out the desolated wreck of its former splendor that which indicates and measures the sublimity of the original temple. The conscience stands erect, resisting all the ravages of violence and decay, and by this we distinguish the temple of God that was, a soul divinely gifted, made to be the abode of his spirit, the vehicle of his power, the mirror of his glory. A creature of remorse is a divine creature of necessity, only it is the wreck of a divinity that was. So again you may conceive the greatness of man by the ruin he makes, if you advert to the dissonance and obstinacy of his evil will. It is dissonant as being out of harmony with God and the world and all beside in the soul itself. The reason, the conscience, the wants, the hopes. How great a creature is it that, knowing God, can set itself off from God and resist him, can make itself a unit, separate from all beings beside, and maintain a persistent rebellion even against its own convictions, fears, and aspirations. Like a pharaoh, it sits on its Egyptian throne, quailing in darkness, under the successive fears and judgments of life, relenting for the moment, then gathering itself up again to reassert the obstinacy of its pride, and die, it may be, in its evil. What a power is this, capable of a dominion how sublime, a work and sphere how transcendent. If sin is weak, if it is mean, little, selfish and deformed, and we are ready to set humanity down as a low and paltry thing of nothing worth, how terrible and tragic in its evil grandeur does it appear, when we turn to look upon its defiance of God and the desperate obstinacy of its warfare. Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasures in them that do them. Or, as we have it in the text, there is no fear of God before their eyes. In one view there is fear enough. The soul is all its lifelong haunted by this fear, but there is a desperation of will that tramples fear and makes it as though it were not. Consider once more the religious aspirations and capacities of religious attractions that are garnered up and still live in the ruins of humanity. How plain it is, in all the most forward demonstrations of the race, that man is a creature for religion, a creature secretly allied to God himself as the needle is to the pole, attracted toward God, aspiring consciously or unconsciously to the friendship and love of God. Neither is it true that, in his fallen state, he has no capacity left of religious affection or attraction, till it is first newly created in him. All his capacities of love and truth are in him still, only buried and stifled by the smouldering ruin in which he lies. There is a capacity in him still to be moved and drawn, to be charmed and melted by the divine love and beauty. The old affinity lives, though, smothered in selfishness and lust, and even proves itself in sorrowful evidence when he bows himself down to a reptile or an idol. He will do his most expensive work for religion. There is a deep panting still in his bosom, however suppressed, that cries inaudibly and sobs with secret longing after God. Hence the sublime unhappiness of the race. There is a vast, immortal want stirring on the world and forbidding it to rest, in the cursing and bitterness, in the deceit of tongues, in the poison of asps, in the swiftness of blood, in all the destruction and misery of the world's ruin. There is yet a vast, insatiate hunger for the good, the true, the divine, and a great part of the misery of the ruin is that it is so great a ruin, a desolation of that which cannot utterly perish, and still lives, asserting its defrauded rights and reclaiming its lost glories. And, therefore, it is that life becomes an experience to the race so tragic in its character, so dark and wild, so bitter, so incapable of peace. The way of peace we cannot know till we find our peace, where our immortal aspirations place it, in the fullness and the friendly eternity of God. End of section 1.